Hey everyone, thanks for jumping back into the React Native universe and welcome to React Native London, October 2021. We've been gone for a month and we've missed you guys and we hope you've missed us as well, but we've been cooking up a series of really nice, exciting talks that we've got for you, but more on that in a bit. I'm Arhan, I'm your host for this evening and I'm from Theodo. Theodo are full stack software consultants and experts in agile and lean. We work with everyone from early stage startups, large corporates, Fortune 500 companies, and everything in between. And our tech stack is React Native, React Serverless, Django, Node, AWS, and we work with a few other ancillary technologies as well. Obviously, today we're here to talk about React Native and the meetup specifically. You should know that we're also hiring at Theodo, like everyone else is in this climate. So if you're a full stack developer, a tech lead, or even if you're on the business side, an agile coach or a project director, please do get in touch. Email us at joinus@theodo.co.uk or send myself a message or any other members of the team. Speaking of new members of the team, we've got a new member joining us, Mo Khazali, who will be giving you a talk later on this evening about styling your apps with Tailwind and using utility-based classes. But before that, let me introduce our series coming up for the next few months. We will be having the Expo series premiering live on React Native London from October to January 2022. This will be a series of talks from members of the Expo core team about getting started with Expo, CI/CD, in-app notifications, even Expo and Next.js together. And we're really, really excited to show you content about this. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the first talk. The first talk will be from Jon Samp, who's a software developer at Expo, and he'll be showing us how to iterate on our apps faster with Expo. So if you've never used Expo before, this is the perfect talk for you. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jon Samp, and thanks so much for coming tonight to this meetup. We've got some really exciting things to talk about, and I am a software developer at Expo, and I want to talk about how you can iterate faster with Expo with your React Native apps to make apps that are great. So one thing I want to talk about is this app that I use called Tweetbot. So Tweetbot is an app that lets you use Twitter, but it doesn't have ads, has a chronological feed, and the design is nice. And I've actually been using this app for a long time. In fact, since Tweetbot 1, here's what it looked like years and years ago. You can see that this design is definitely antiquated by today's standards. It's got these skeuomorphic design elements, which are kind of hilariously coming back into style these days. It does everything that Twitter does, but it definitely looks old. If I were to ship something that looked like this today, people would say that looks antiquated. So what Tweetbot did is in their third version of their app, they, around iOS 7, came out with this design. And I bet we'll all remember this iOS design with these thin line icons. This is not really quite in style anymore, but they had to change with the times to make their app updated for what the world expected. Finally, this is what Tweetbot looks like today. It still has some of those sort of thin line icons, but they're a little thicker and it's a little more modern, and it looks really nice based on today's design standards. If we look at this spread, this is a blast from the past and a timeline that's pretty interesting to look at. I mean, look, they've changed so much. And what this got me to realize after using this app for so long is that the first version of our app can never be the final version of our app. And while that is like sort of frustrating because like as someone who designs and makes apps, it means that my first design and the first iteration of my app is always going to be changing. And what I've realized is that people almost never talk about this. They don't talk about like how to get your app in a process to where you're iterating on it consistently. So that's what I want to talk about today. How can we embrace iteration with our React Native apps and with Expo? So let's talk about what iteration looks like with React Native. This is what I think it looks like. And this is like the circle of fun for me. So it starts out with requirements, like what should our apps do? Then it moves on to implementation, where we actually build the thing. Then we have to review that the implementation meets the requirements. Then we have to build it, we have to submit it, and then we have to find any bugs and fix those bugs, which also turn into requirements. And then this circle goes around and around. So we're going to start with requirements. And to make this talk a little bit more interesting and applicable to something that I love, let's brew a coffee app together. So let's cheers to that and figure out how we can make this great. So I don't know if you're into coffee, but if you are, there are a few things that we would need to make a great coffee app. The first thing is we would have a requirement to have a calculator to show us the right amount of water to the right amount of coffee we want to brew. If you haven't brewed a bunch of coffee before, 1 gram of coffee, you need 16 grams of water to offset that while you're brewing. And in the morning, it's kind of hard to do this math. Like if I have 27 grams of coffee, then I have to do 27 times 16. That's kind of a lot to do right when I wake up. So it'd be nice if an app could do this simple calculation for us. We're going to have a second requirement as well, which is during making a pour over coffee, we have to pour different amounts of water over different amounts of time. This is called pulse pouring. So we'd probably want some timers. We want some calculations to accomplish this for us. So this is the app we're going to build today. So let's go on to implementation. How can we start making this app from scratch? The first thing that we'll do is run npm install global expo CLI. The CLI is going to help us create our app. We can run expo init coffee app. And what this is going to give us is a code editor and a directory structure that looks like this. Now, the important thing to realize here is that there is not an iOS or Android folder inside of this directory structure. That might look a little odd if you've created a React Native app before, but it totally works here. And you can just write JavaScript and TypeScript. Now, there is still iOS and Android dependencies that will build into apps with this Expo app, but a lot of apps don't need those native controls. With Expo, you can choose to put those folders back in and to manage those if you want. But if you don't need them, then you don't have to deal with them, which is kind of nice. So once we have Expo init this project, we can run yarn start. And this is going to allow us to start our app inside of an Android emulator or an iOS simulator. You've probably done something similar before if you've used React Native. Now, one thing that I've noticed when making apps is that sometimes the things in the simulator are not the things that actually appear on my device. Things act in small different ways. And so one way that Expo helps us is that we have an app called Expo Go, which is free on the app stores and you can download it. And when you run yarn start, we'll output a QR code into your terminal. With Expo Go, you can scan this QR code and it's going to show you a live preview of your code on your actual device, which gives you a preview that's going to be a lot more veracious or a lot more true to what your app actually does. So I find this a great way to develop. Okay, so we've been talking about Expo a lot. What is Expo exactly? So Expo is a company that builds free open source tools. We also provide hosted services that help you build an application with React Native. So we need to talk about like, how does React Native and Expo fit together? I think it turns out to be this, where React Native provides you with component APIs, styling APIs, as a small unopinionated core and a bunch of libraries that you can use to build apps. But you need so much more to build apps. And that's where Expo comes in. We allow you to build full applications with our component SDK, with our tools like Expo Go. And then we also have services we're going to talk about soon to build, submit, and then update your app as you find bugs and as you need to iterate. And we are powered by React Native underneath in the implementation details. Okay, so going back to the coffee app, I actually spent a lot of time trying to design this coffee app, and here's some of the iterations I went through. And after doing some development time, I actually came up with an app that does these two requirements that we were talking about earlier. Here on the left, you can insert the amount of coffee you would like to output. And then if you look at the bottom of that screenshot, you can see how many grams of coffee you would need to grind. And then on the right side, you can see those dotted horizontal lines. This is a pulse pouring indicator. So now our app is ready to go. and we want to actually start using it. And I should note that after doing all of this, I was pretty hyped up on coffee, and you might be as well. So this has been a fun process so far. Okay, cool. So we can move on to the next iteration cycle, which is review, to make sure that our implementation actually meets our requirements. And we run into a problem here, which is how can you let other people try your app? Our goal is to get our app on somebody's phone so that they can tap on it and interact with it like it's a real app, but we don't want it public on the app stores. And it would be nice if we didn't have to submit it to TestFlight, and if we didn't have to go through the Google Play Store internal test track too, because that process takes a long time. Luckily, there is another way to do this, and I'm going to explain how we would do this without Expo first. This process is called internal distribution, and this allows you to sideload an app onto other people's devices. And I'm just going to talk about iOS for this process right now, just to give you one side of what we'd have to do. So if you want to share an app on someone else's phone, we have to go through a series of steps. And the first one is we would need to collect the device UDIDs from all of your colleagues and friends, and then register them inside of the App Store Connect portal, which is pictured here. After that, we would need to create something called an ad hoc provisioning profile, which we can do in the App Store Connect console. And then we'd have to send it to our colleagues. And then we'd also have to explain to them how to install it on their phones. Now, it's okay if you're not familiar with these particular things right now, because I hope that we can make this easier here shortly. Finally, after they install this provisioning profile, we would have to create a build that's configured with all of their devices. And then we would have to store that build somewhere, and then we'd have to share it with our colleagues somewhere. So we have to do all of these steps every single time we have a new build or a new user, to make sure that we can let the people, like our colleagues and our friends, download this. So what if we could automate this process, but without having to automate it ourselves, because that takes a lot of time, it's a lot of work, and you want to focus on building your app. It turns out we can with something called EAS. This stands for Expo Application Services, and we automated the internal distribution flow. So let's look at what this looks like. So we could run npm install in a new CLI tool called EAS CLI, which is separate from Expo CLI. So EAS CLI is a cloud CI/CD service that helps you build, submit, and update your app. And it's a window to all of our cloud services. So let's go through the same steps again, but now with EAS. So the first thing we need to do is collect device UDIDs. To start off this process, we could run a command called EAS device create. What this is going to do is print a QR code into our terminal, and then a link that we can share with our colleagues and our friends. If they go to this link, it is going to do everything for them. It's going to collect their UDIDs. It's going to save it to your credentials. And it's also going to explain to them how to install the provisioning profile and where to tap on their phone to enable that. So pretty much it automates all of this process away. We don't have to create this provisioning profile ourselves or share it with people or explain to them, because our website and the CLI will do that for you. Finally, we need to create a build that's configured with those devices. And instead of having to configure something manually in Xcode or in Android Studio, we can run a command called EAS build with a profile called internal. So we can build your app for you, and you can configure how that build is made. And here's what that configuration looks like. We have this file called eas.json. So all the configuration is JSON, and this is all of the configuration you need to make an internal distribution build. After we run that command, we're going to get two builds, an IPA build and also an APK build that includes everything we need to share it with our colleagues. After that, we'll be able to see the build on the Expo website, which is going to tell us everything about the build. And it also has this install button that we can share with someone, and they can scan a QR code to directly install it on their device. Or we could do something even like this, where we send them a message with a link. They go to this site, and then it will download it directly to their device. It makes it really quick. So if we go through like these two processes for illustration purposes, before we have to do all of these little steps to get us to the send link phase. But with EAS, we've automated a lot of this process so that you can get to the send link phase a lot faster. And this is really our goal around EAS, to make a lot of these processes simpler so you can spend more time working on your app and building features that your users are going to love. But what if we could make this even faster? We also have a GitHub action called Expo GitHub action, and we could have a configuration for a GitHub CI action that looks like this. Now, most of this is setup code, lines 1 through 22, but line 23 is really where the magic happens. We've got this EAS build command that has a profile internal and also non-interactive, which would allow us to, on merging something to our main branch, to make these builds automatically. So we wouldn't even have to run a command. It is so nice. I can't explain enough to push to Git and have something just ready for you in a few minutes that you can share with your colleagues. It makes reviewing PRs, it makes sharing new features with your team faster. You can try out more things and allow people to try out more things without going through tons of process to get there. So this is really cool. Let's say that we've made it through the review phase and now we're ready for the actual build phase for the app stores. We have a new problem, which is how can we distribute apps on the app stores? Now, I'm not going to go through every single step like I just did with internal distribution, but in general, at least for iOS, we would need to do these 3 things inside of Xcode, and we would have to do them manually and also know how to accomplish these steps. Luckily, EAS is here to do this for us, and they can do it for your whole team in the cloud. So nobody has to think about these implementation steps. So what this looks like in code is EAS build can have a different profile called production this time. And it's going to create an IPA as well as an AAB file. These files are different since they're signed for the App Store. So they're ready to be published to public end users. What this configuration would look like in that EAS JSON file looks like this, where we'd have a production profile and an internal profile. So this production one, that is default. So we don't need any extra production things here. There is a lot of different options we can add in this profile, but for our purposes now, this is all we need. Similarly to before, we would see details about this build on our website, and we could download the build and we can see everything in the logs about it as well. And we can also see who built it, which is really nice for working with your team. Okay, so now we've made a build for the App Store. Now it's time to submit it. Now, I've submitted a lot of apps to the app stores, and it is kind of a rigmarole that I guess makes sense once you get it, but it's just a lot of stuff that isn't super fun to do, and it just takes time. On the Android side, I would have to drag and drop this AAB file into the Play Store console. On the iOS side, I have to drag and drop this thing into a transporter app, and then I have to wait for the archives to upload and process. Now, there are ways to automate these steps, but I also don't want to spend all of my time automating steps for an app that I'm just trying to get out to allow people to make some coffee. So EAS is here again to help us out. We have this command called EAS submit. And this will take any builds made with EAS, or actually any builds at all, and submit them to the stores for us. It will save our credentials and we can submit things automatically. In fact, we just came out with a new flag where you can say EAS build, and then there's a flag called auto submit. This will, when you make a build, if it's successful, automatically submit it to the stores. It's so nice being able to run a command like this or merge into a branch and have your code build and submitted to the stores without doing really anything. Okay, so now we're ready to probably the hardest part of the journey of this, which is fixing bugs. So I'm going to introduce a bug to our coffee app. A popular way to make coffee is through something called an AeroPress. But let's say that someone got confused when building this app, and instead of saying AeroPress, they said Sparrow dress. I have to admit, this is pretty contrived. It's really hard to rhyme with AeroPress, so I just made something up, but just go with me here, okay? So let's say we want to fix this bug. What would we have to do? We'd have to fix the bug. So we have to fix this typo, which is relatively simple. Then we'd have to rebuild our apps. Then we have to submit them to the stores again. We have to wait for review. And then once they're on the stores again, we have to wait for our end users to download them. This could take days, if not weeks. Expo has a solution to this, which is called updates, and it can help you provide small fixes between your builds. Let's look at how this works. So we have this command called Expo publish. So this is through Expo CLI, and this particular one for now, instead of EAS publish. So this is Expo publish. And to learn how this works, we need to understand that our apps are actually built up into different layers. Our apps have a native code layer, which you can see here in the middle as that black version. And then they also have this JS code layer that sits on top. Now, this JS code layer is interchangeable. So by running Expo publish, we can create a new JavaScript bundle of our app. We can store it on Expo servers, And then when someone opens your app, it will automatically check to see if there's any new JS code available. If there is, it'll load the new code and it'll interchange it out with the bug fixes. So we can push out a bug fix like this typo fix immediately when a user reopens their app. This is super powerful and allows us to fix things. It also de-risks how much iteration costs our team, because if we make a mistake, it's pretty easy to fix. Okay, so this was a lot of stuff and a lot of things that you can do with Expo. If you've used Expo before, we actually have a bunch of recent updates that are new and upcoming in the next month. So one of those is that now you can build with any native code. So if you want to add in-app purchases, if you want to add Bluetooth, you can do that with Expo now and with EAS. We also have something called custom dev clients. A custom development client is your app, but an app that we add an app that we build our developer tools to, so that you can get access to like a performance monitor and inspection tools. And you don't have to use our Expo Go off the App Store. If you have native code, you can build your app with all of our tools and still like get all of the benefits of Expo Go, but only using your app. So that's definitely worth something checking out. Finally, we have something called an EAS update that's incoming in a few months. And this is a revamp of our publish system that we just talked about. That's going to allow you to do so much more with connecting updates to builds and also in the future rolling them out. So a lot of exciting stuff is coming here. Now, all this stuff with EAS is currently in preview. We have a $29 a month subscription, which as a part of that, you get early access to these features like EAS. However, next month, we are coming out with this as a public thing, and there's going to be a generous free tier, and that will always be a generous free tier. So you can use this on hobby projects. You can use this when you're starting a project to try all of this out. So next month, definitely look out for this. Okay, cool. So let's figure out how to iterate faster to get changes out to our users quicker so that we can find the features that our users love even quicker. Expo allows you to do this in a lot of ways, whether it is not having to deal with native code dependencies. We allow you to work faster with internal distribution. We allow you to build and submit your apps to the app stores automatically with CI actions. And you can also fix critical bugs with updates to top it all off. So it is coffee time. Hopefully you have a coffee or a tea or something next to you, or maybe tomorrow. I guess it's sort of late. But anyway, thanks so much for iterating with me and listening to my talk. Also, thanks so much to the organizers for letting me speak today. I think now we're going to move into a Q&A section. Oh, Aaron, you're muted, Aaron.
Hey guys, thanks so much for that talk, John. I think we can all agree that's such a nice introduction to Expo and so succinctly gone over so many different things that Expo can do. I mean, there's even stuff there that I didn't really know about. So thanks so much for that. I was wondering, just before we kick off with the questions, what's your kind of background or role at Expo as well? If you could tell us a bit about that.
So I've been at Expo for about 2 years now. I'm a software developer there. I do mostly front-end work. And lately, I've also been doing a lot of design work and thinking about how we can make our CLIs, our websites, our docs, et cetera, all feel a little bit more cohesive.
Nice, cool. So yeah, that's great to know. Let's go on to a few questions. I see Kath has got a question that I was actually dying to know myself. What has to be done and how easy is it to move from an already built React Native project? So, I like what you've said, and there's a lot of cool things there. I've got a React Native project that's whatever, 50,000 lines deep, and I want to include Expo somehow. What's your best kind of advice or recommendations for that?
Sure. So one thing to note is that Expo kind of has two sides. We have an open source side where we maintain a lot of high quality packages that you can use in any React Native app. Also, all of the services I just talked about, whether it's building or submitting or updating, you can use without initializing your app with Expo. So you can still submit or like do all of those things with your app that is already existing. One thing that like is kind of hard for us is to define like what is using Expo. And I think it's anyone who's using our modules, because you can use those in any projects, or anyone who's using our services. So you're not boxed into a walled garden with us. We want one of the like decisions we made was like with those GitHub actions I was showing, you can control exactly how those work for your own purposes, instead of us doing it automatically for you, like behind a wall, like behind our company walls. So that's always our purpose, to let you include these in any app that you want. I'm happy to like walk you through those steps if you hit me up on Twitter after.
Sweet, nice. At Jon Samp, is it?
That's at Jon Samp, Jon Samp.
Sweet, nice. Beware for your DMs. Sorry, bro. Yeah. And another thing that I wanted to ask is one of the, let's say, criticisms that Expo has maybe at times is that, okay, it abstracts away even more than React Native does the native capabilities or functionalities of a mobile app. And I know that there's something called Expo eject that you can do, but maybe for people who are kind of nervous about, should I really abstract away even more than React Native is already to Expo? What would you say to them, or why is Expo still a good option?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is like the number one thing that developers and rightfully complain about Expo, which is you don't have access to those iOS and Android folders. Like I want my native code to work in my app, and I have something that needs it. So can I use Expo? And the answer was always not really. Like you need to eject and just have a regular like React Native project. So this is something we've been working on for the last year and a half. And this is where EAS came from really, which is let people build with any native code. And so you can stay within our projects without any native code if you want. You can also add something new called a config plugin, which will allow you to edit native files at build time, or you can go all the way and manage those iOS and Android projects just the same and still build them with our builders. So we aren't walling people in anymore, and we're allowing people to do things like add in-app purchases or have Bluetooth or use like React Native blur hash, which takes a native dependency.
Right. So with let's say in-app purchases, for example, would I still have to write Swift or Objective-C and Java, or it's abstracted away with the Expo's libraries themselves?
So for in-app purchases in particular, we have a library called Expo in-app purchases, which sets up all the native code you need to accomplish that. And then you can add in the appropriate keys that will be included at build time. But maybe you have a feature that needs like something very specific that there is no library for. So you can also create a plugin to do that, or you can just include the native code in your project and edit it manually. Like if you want to edit something in the app delegate.m or the Android manifest.xml, you can do that too.
Right. Sweet. Let me head over to the comments.
Let me ask a question while you're doing that, Arahan, as well.
Sure.
The publish feature that you showed was really interesting, and I think it's a lifesaver in probably a lot of cases. My curiosity with that is, how does that tie into the whole review process that, let's say, the Google Play Store might have or the App Store might have? How does that interact with that?
That's a great question. So the bottom line here is you always need to abide by the App Store rules. We are not here to like subvert any of those. One way that I've used updates in the past is to fix, like if I have bugs, like I'm trying to call something like on undefined, and I'm able to fix that, I'll push that over. Or if I have something small like a bug fix, it helps me between my builds. One thing I think is really important for iteration is that like you need to have consistent builds. If you're only doing updates, it actually over time, like so let's say I have 1,000 updates I've made, people are going to have to like download the diff between the build they got as well as the 1,000th update. So it's helpful to build and go through the review process regularly. Our goal is not to like let you submit one app to the App Store and then change it significantly, because that would be against the rules. But so we use it just to fix like critical small things in between builds.
Nice. Cool. So yeah, having a look at questions from the comments, I noticed that someone there, CH Gara SG. Oops. Let me just wave to get some light back. Conference room problems. So yeah, someone's got a debugging question, but I think it's best if you just slide into Jon's DMs on Twitter for that problem. But yeah, we've also got Seema Zaga, who's asking, does Ionic have limitations in design compared to React Native? And I'm not sure if you want to give your opinions on this, if you've used Ionic before or not.
Sure. I used Ionic years ago, so I'm not sure what the current state of things is. One thing that's different from React Native and Ionic, and I could be wrong on this, so don't hold me to the fire for this particular one, is that React Native ties into the native APIs that are actually used in like Swift and Java. And so like if you call a toggle element, you're getting a real genuine native toggle element. I believe Ionic emulates these with styles. And with like JavaScript and like CSS or other styles to emulate this. So it's not using the genuine native thing. I could be wrong. Maybe they've changed that, but that's my understanding.
Right, right. Cool. Well, we've had a fair few questions, and yeah, thank you so much for your time and giving your opinions on all of these as well, Jon. So yeah, without further ado, let's move on to our second talk for the evening, which is Speedy Styling in Tailwind by Mo Khazali.
Hey folks, thanks for taking the time to come to React Native London meetup. It's going to be a tough act to follow after Jon, but I'll give it my best shot. Speedy styling with Tailwind and React Native. As I'm sure everyone here has experienced, styling is not always necessarily the easiest or most favorably looked upon part of front-end development. So tonight we're going to take a deep dive into how we can take the repetition out of your styling using Tailwind and speed it up by quite a fair bit. My hope is that this will prompt us to have a revisit about the ways that we approach our styling when it comes to modern day frameworks in front end. My name is Mo. I'm a full stack developer at Theodo UK. We are a software consultancy in London, and we have specialized teams that develop software products in a lean or agile manner. Our clients love working with Theodo, and our team in London gets some really great experience working on a wide range of projects, and I can personally testify to that. And on that, yes, we are hiring, so feel free to message me or Erohan or any one of the other organizers if you have any questions or are thinking of applying. Let's jump into it. So a brief slide on what we're going to cover tonight. Firstly, for a little bit of background, and just to justify the thinking behind Tailwind and this talk, we're going to touch on the mirage of separation of concerns. This is a very bold claim, so hold on with adding me just yet. And then we're going to follow that up with utility first styling. So this is the alternative approach that libraries such as Tailwind take. And we'll talk about the benefits and the philosophy behind why you should use utility first styling. And then afterwards, we'll introduce Tailwind, exploring some of the pros, some of the places where it lags behind, so some of the cons to the approach, followed by a live demo, which will most definitely go wrong at some point, famous last words. And lastly, just some closing thoughts, and hopefully following that by a Q&A. But just before I jump into this talk, I was having a chat with a colleague about this talk a few days ago, and that night I took a long, hard stare at myself in the mirror and asked why. Now, mind you, this wasn't me having some sort of existential doubt or going through some sort of early onset midlife crisis. I was asking myself, why am I doing this talk? I personally think that the way that we approach styling over the years hasn't adopted at the same speed in line with the paradigm shifts that we've seen in most front-end development. And my hope is that this talk will spur some sort of conversation, some questions about the ways that we can improve styling and make it a bit more efficient in our day-to-day development. And I say this with the utmost sincerity. I am not trying to start a holy war in the community about which styling library works best. I don't want to say that you should strip out, if you have a React project, you should strip out style components and use Tailwind instead, or that you should fully adopt all of your projects to use Tailwind. But I want to explore what works well with Tailwind and what we can learn from it in our day-to-day styling. All right, let's jump right into it. So the mirage of separation of concerns, with the caveat that I will only be making this very, very bold claim when it comes to front-end development. So that asterisk is there to hopefully save me some slack. So take a few seconds to think about the concept of separation of concerns and try to come up for a definition that makes sense to you. When I was working on this presentation, I looked around a lot for various definitions, and you get them in many forms, but the simplest, most generic one that I came across was this one. Don't write your program as one solid block. Instead, break up the code into chunks that are tiny pieces of the system, each able to complete a simple, distinct job. And this is seen all around in programming and development. The most common example that you'll get is the intranet protocol stack. So each layer within the intranet should, in theory, be separated from the other layers. It doesn't have any information about the other layers. And the idea and one of the benefits is that they all do small individual parts of connecting users to the internet. You can take away the network layer, and hopefully the rest of the system can function if you were to insert a different implementation of that layer. So you see this in different places as well. So if you're working on backend architecture, a classic example is the CQRS architecture approach, where your mutations and your querying is completely separated out. They're abstracted away so that each single small component deals with certain concerns. And also, of course, in front-end development, the traditional model here is that each bit of the front end is independent from each other, and that they're dealing with each of the concerns. So we've got the structure layer that's handled by HTML. We've got the styling layer that's handled by the CSS, and the functionality, of course, is handled by JavaScript. So let's jump in a little bit more into the front-end development side of things. How is this done on the web? So we have a little sort of example on the right. This is some very classic HTML. And this, what you're seeing here is the semantic approach, which handles separation of concerns, oftentimes referred to as the block element modifier approach. And the idea here is that you avoid any styles coming into your markup. So at the top, you can see that the class names here within the HTML are done in a manner where they're talking about the semantic value and what the information is within this web page or within this view that you're displaying. So things like author bio, another class is the author bio image, author bio content, author bio name. Again, very semantic, very informational about what data is going in, what is the content. And so your styles here are going to be based off of these class names. So you will separate these out completely. So none of your styles are actually leaking into your markup. This is the classic approach. And this doesn't violate separation of concerns. However, and there is a but here, your markup has actually come into your styles. So there is an illusion of separation of concerns, but in reality, that is the mirage. And if you look at how we develop these days, this mirage is actually is really highlighted to a larger degree. Separation of concerns is violated in various places when we're looking at front-end development. Specifically when it comes to React, the very foundations of React and a lot of other JavaScript frameworks is based on violating separation of concerns, making it simpler for you to put and combine your markup and your functionality together. So JSX, which is one of the biggest selling points of React, if not the biggest selling point of React, is markup within functionality. It's built on the premise of violating separation of concerns. And similarly, there's various other libraries that we use in day-to-day development. So if you're working on a React project, style components, which is one of the most widely used libraries for styling, is putting styling into your functional components. You're taking a component and you're styling it. So you're coupling together these different concerns, and it's already being violated. So very much this concept of separation of concerns, specifically when it comes to front-end development, when it comes to web dev, is not necessarily something that is strictly adhered to, and is already being sacrificed for certain benefits that we get by combining some of these components. And again, there's various other examples of how there are new frameworks and there's new technologies that are violating separation of concerns. Another framework that recently came out that got a lot of news was Svelte, and Svelte couples together your styling, your markup, and your functionality all within one file natively. So I think that's the general trend of where front end is going at. And so this mirage of separation of concerns is in fact not necessarily being applied to the full extent anymore. And that leads us forward to utility-first styling. And so this is an alternative approach taken. So what does utility-first styling mean? The idea is that you prioritize reusability above all else. And so you start asking yourself questions about what is the most common CSS that you find yourself writing. And I'm sure that there is these things that you find that you are consistently adding into your code. Things like adding a margin right of about 7 pixels. Other things like setting the font size to a specific value. So the font size of, let's say, 2 rem. Or adding a border radius of 100% to get that very nice, fully rounded profile picture that we have on probably most of our websites, on most of our personal portfolios. So these are the common bits and components that you put within your styling on a day-to-day basis. So what utility-first styling suggests is just put them in a class. Make each one of these small individual components a single class. So the first one on the left is margin right small. So you add a small margin to the right of this component or this element. The next one is setting the text size to medium. You define these aliases and you say, I have a class now. For whenever I want to have a medium-sized text, I will just use this class. And the last one, of course, as it's self-explanatory, is full rounded. And so the goal, ultimately, is for you to be able to create new components without touching CSS. So you have a set of predefined, highly reusable classes. Whether or not you make them yourself or you use a library is a different story. But the idea is that you, in theory, would never need to go in and create additional classes, because you could always combine certain classes from these highly reusable classes that you've predefined to build completely new components and style it however you'd like. So these utility classes are usually setting things like the font color, maybe the font size, the weighting of the fonts. Things like flexbox and grid is a very common piece of functionality that you'll find plenty of within your CSS, and also things like setting the padding and the margin. So you might be thinking to yourself, what is the benefit to taking this approach as opposed to that separation of concerns approach? Well, I'm going to highlight 2 main ones, but there's a whole sort of literature on the internet if you want to go ahead and research some of the added benefits of taking this approach. But the main one that I want to focus on is consistency. And so we've got the Steve Ballmer developers GIF here. I really want to stress the consistency approach. By having and defining these smaller reusable classes, you have less choice in terms of having sort of blunders within the values that you set in your CSS. So if you're not constantly interacting with CSS, manually setting the text size to a certain number of rem, or manually setting the margin and the padding every single time you want to build a new component, then there's less grounds for you to fall into inconsistencies. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is the type of thing that code reviews are for. You'll get one of your peers to look at your code and maybe see, hey, this font size that you've used isn't actually standard in line with what we've been using. However, I want to point to the data here to show that this isn't always necessarily upheld in practice. So as an example, you might, somebody went through a list of some of the big sort of tech websites, things like GitHub, things like Stripe, and GitLab, and they looked at their style sheets and the number of text colors that they had, the number of background colors that they had, and all of their styling. And so they found that even across some of these websites where, I'm sure they have very, very talented developers, the number of inconsistencies is massive. You get on GitLab 402 different text colors, several hundred background colors, and 59 different font sizes. So that oftentimes will occur when you have something like the font size set to 1.3 rem instead of 1.25 rem. And so having your hands open isn't always the best thing in this case. Another benefit is the speed. So a lot of people have been about saying that by using utility-first styling, or Tailwind specifically, their speed of development has massively accelerated. And the idea is you're not constantly needing to jump between your CSS and your component. You can just stay within your component. And if you're familiar with the class names, which I'll touch on slightly later, if you're familiar with the class names, you can simply just use them repeatedly within your code, and it's less flicking between different parts of your code and looking and referencing different parts of your code. And in theory, that makes it a lot quicker to code and to just push out pieces of functionality and deliver value. So how does this end up looking in code? So these are a lot of abstract ideas. How does it end up actually manifesting within code? So what you get is something like this. Now, if you take a look at some of the class names here, these are somewhat descriptive of what the styling actually should look like. So you've got a div here called card, and then it's rounded, so you can see rounded corners around the card. It's got a little bit of a shadow. Again, you can see that here. It's got a padding y, so py of 3, and this is some 3 units, so to speak, and we'll touch more on that. px4, so there's a padding on the x side for 4, so on and so forth. And some of these make sense. So you've got things like flex being dealt with in part of a utility class. You've got things like the text being set to large for this title. Again, padding here, borders, so on and so forth. This isn't Tailwind, but this is following the ideas of utility first styling. And when you show this to people for the first time, typically the reactions are not the most favorable. So you get the classic people just shrugging it off and saying that the whole idea is stupid and you might as well just be using inline styles for your entire project. You get somebody who's gone on a rant and is a little upset about Tailwind, and they give it a fair shot, but they don't really like it anymore. And then you just get the blatant rants completely trashing Tailwind and everything to do with utility for styling. So the initial approach, the initial response that people give is not very favorable, to say the least. And so at this point, you might be thinking to yourself in this presentation, is this guy that's sitting out here talking to you about utility for styling and Tailwind an absolute madman? And should we just ignore everything he's saying? And I want to loop back to the why of this talk. And I want to say that pragmatically, I don't believe that this approach should be applied to every single project that you're making. I think that it's good for certain projects. I think that there's a lot to learn from this. But I fundamentally don't think that you should strip out everything that you've been using for styling and replace it with Tailwind. So that's the idea of utility for styling. If you're interested in learning more about sort of the theoretical aspect of what goes behind Tailwind and some of the thinkings behind it, the creator, Adam Wanthon, he's written a great blog post, which if you just search up utility for styling and separation of concerns, he talks about this, the paradigms, what the thinking was behind it, and some of the examples that are used here are straight from that blog post. So I would highly recommend giving that a read. But as he mentions as well, this is the type of thing that you just need to try once until you just have to try it once, and then you'll hopefully understand how it works, and it'll kind of make more sense. So yeah, let's go ahead with that and introduce Tailwind now. So Tailwind capitalizes on this whole idea, this whole concept of utility first styling, and comes pre-built with these utility first styles, or these utility first classes, essentially. And so it's been getting a lot of headway within the front-end development community because of the various reasons that I mentioned. So let's take a look at this to start with. So this is from the Tailwind website. If you go onto the main page, you'll see this example. And so you can see how quickly the code styles are changing for this card component just by adding a few class names to it. So the image gets rounded, the margins get set to auto, which makes it centered. The font gets set to semi-bold, medium for the caption. We set the color of the name to be Cayenne, and we set the color of the other one to change. So very quickly, you can see that the styles are changing massively. And so you'll see right there, they added a media query, and automatically it's fully responsive. And so I'll touch on some of the pros and the cons of what Tailwind offers as a library. So to start off with, some of the pros of Tailwind. Massive manual styling time is saved, and I can't emphasize this enough. Most of the styles that you would ever need to do come pre-built as part of this library, so to speak. And if you want to set things like the width of a component, you can do that. If you want to set it to different shades of a color, and as I'll touch on afterwards, this is fully customizable as well. You can do that. You can set different states. So on hover, setting the background to to a certain color, on focus, setting the background to another color. Again, this is for web specifically, but since these sort of hover and focus states don't work on React Native, but the functionality is there, and it tries to imitate almost everything that you would be able to do with CSS, but in a consistent, clean manner that will save you a lot of time. The next point is that it's highly portable. So by having your styles as part of your components, it means that if you're wanting to copy over a specific part of your component tree and move it to another project, or maybe another part of maybe another page, you can simply copy it over and it copies all of the styling with it. You don't need to be concerned with finding where the styles are. Maybe it's a few components up the tree and you need to copy the styles from there. There's none of that. It makes it highly portable, which I think is a very key and helpful pro of Tailwind. It makes developing and iterating a lot quicker again. Thirdly, it's entirely customizable. So there's a Tailwind's overrides file, and you can update all of the utility functions across the board by just updating that file. You can add new colors, you can modify the values that exist, maybe the units as well. So this makes it very customizable for projects. If you have specific needs that you want to style, or you have specific graphic designs that you want to stay on standard with, this will be highly customizable here. And lastly, responsiveness. So this is one of the things that one of my colleagues was telling me the other day. Tailwind comes out of the box with these great responsive media query classes. And if anyone's written CSS, you'll know that media queries can be sometimes a bit of a nightmare. So the responsiveness out of the box is one of the key selling factors here within Tailwind. Now let's touch on some of the places where it lags behind a little bit. This definitely takes an adjustment. So you've seen having your styles integrated within your markup. It's kind of a double-edged sword. And so what that means is oftentimes you'll have very, very verbose component and class names. And so that is definitely an adjustment. Some people really don't like it. Some people get used to it. So it's something to definitely consider. And I think that it's something that requires a bit of time, requires a bit of just experimenting with it. The syntax can become cluttered. Again, going back to this, I think this is it's a double-edged sword. It's great that it's highly portable, but it also means that in some cases, you're gonna have a very cluttered syntax. And it's not a UI library. So it means that it doesn't come pre-built with these components that you can put into your project and just use them built out of the box. It's a very simple and quick way to make good components. So it's kind of synonymous with styled components rather than something like Material UI if you were using React. So those are some of the cons that I would mention, and of course a bit of a learning curve. So you need to pick up the class names, which takes a little bit of time, a little bit of getting used to. Personally, it took me about an hour and a bit to fully get on board and really pick it up. I still refer to the documentation here and there, but there's some great ecosystem being built around it, where you have IntelliJ where you have VS Code plugins and whatnot that allow you to fill in and auto-complete some of these class names. So it's becoming a much simpler to pick it up, and I think the learning curve is quite minimal compared to a lot of other technologies. Cool. So without further ado, let's jump into the demo. And I'm going to shift over to my handy VS Code and emulator that I've got open. As John mentioned, go and use Expo. It's great. It makes the process of spawning something up like this massively simple. And honestly, I would highly recommend it, especially if you're starting out with React Native. So let's jump into our app components. I've got something sort of set up here. It comes with this little badge here in a view that says Hello Tailwind, and another view here that's kind of styled like a button with the text here, big red button. It's obviously not styled, but we're going to do that together, and hopefully we'll learn a thing or two about it while we go ahead with that. Awesome. So let's begin by changing the color of this text. So this isn't very viewable. We've got a gray background. It's not very user friendly. So let's go ahead and just change that to white. So as you might expect, it might be something like text white. And as you put that in, we'll save it. And there, your text is changed to white. So that's a good first step. Let's keep going with it and see what else we can get. Let's remove this margin. So this is a MT12, which means a margin top of 12 units. And you can refer back to the Tailwind documentation about these units. So let's get rid of MT12. And so what that'll do hopefully is shrink this margin in between the red button and this Hello Tailwind badge. And so we've got that. Great. So we already have a padding here for our button. So we have a padding X of 4 and a padding Y of 2 units. We have a border. We've set that border to transparent so that we don't have any default borders. And we've set the text size to be small with a font weight of medium. So it's slightly emboldened. Now let's add a background because this isn't very viewable right now. Let's add a background of, and at this point I get a little stuck and I'm thinking to myself, what were the colors that Tailwind has? So if you have the Tailwind documentation open, and this is their really nice website, you can quickly go ahead and search the docs and find the name of the classes or what you're looking for. So let's say I'm looking for indigo. You can see the different colors that exist here. So let's say I want to look at the backgrounds. Let's click on this indigo here, and it'll show us the range of different colors that they have within this documentation. I must say this is probably one of the best documentations that I've personally seen with any library. So it's really, truly fascinating to me. So I've taken a look at the colors. I think the background indigo of 600 looks good to me. So let's go ahead and add that. And so we now have an indigo button. Great. Now let's make this a rounded, let's add a bit of rounding to this, but let's see what the different classes are that we can add to this. So there's a rounded small, there's a rounded, and there's a rounded medium. I like the rounded medium, so we're going to go ahead and add that. Cool. So we now have a slightly rounded button. Great. Now this Hello Tailwind tag was good, but let's switch it up a little bit because I don't think it's particularly very useful right now. Let's see if we can try to shape this as a notification counter type of looking view. So let's add the number 1 here to give it text. Cool. That was good. So now let's change the text to actually be red. I'll put it to red to 900, and let's keep the font as semi-bold, so it's slightly emboldened. So that color is red, although it's not really showing. And let's go ahead and start changing some of the positioning. So let's firstly change this background yellow to also be red before that. So we've gone ahead and done that, and we'll just get rid of the padding altogether. So we'll say it should be a width of 6 and a height of 6 as well. And so we've done that, but that's messed up our text. That's all right. We're going to go ahead and copy some of the classes here that I have from before. So we're going to set it to flex on the column direction, and we'll center the items and set a justify center as well. And then by doing that, hopefully we should get a fully centered text. Great. So that's worked out there. Let's go ahead and now see if we can position this button, this notification counter right on the corner of there. So let's go ahead and start. I don't remember the inset value, so I'm just going to quickly flip back to the Tailwind docs. So there's a left 2. Let's look at that. Awesome. So we have something like that. There's the left 1, left -1. And so you get all these different rem values here that are, again, fully customizable. If you don't like the values here, or if they don't work within your styling standards, you can go ahead and change them in the Tailwind config overrides. So let's go back. So they've got things like left, and it's a dash. So it's things like a top dash 3.5. So let's try to do that and see where we can get. So let's start with left 2 and see how that works. Okay, just moved it a little bit. Still not the best thing. Let's move it to 2.5. But before we do that, let's actually move this alignment to the right. So what this means is we'll set the text align to be the end. So now our view has both the button and the notification counter pushed to the end, so it's right aligned, so to speak. So now we've set this to left 0.2, still not fully to where I would like to get it at. So let's give it a shot for 2.5 maybe. Great, I think that looks good to me. Let's add a top as well. So let's try a top of 1. Still not as far down as I would like that to be. So let's do top of 3 there. Okay, that's good. The Z index isn't looking too good though, so let's just add a Z index. So I happen to know off the top of my head that the Z index is just simply Z10. And if we do that, we've just given it a Z index of 10. And so just through that, without defining any styles whatsoever, we've gone ahead and we've created some wonderful styling out of the box with all of the Tailwind utility first classes. So that's kind of a demo of how it works with React Native. You need to include these Tailwind, the Tailwind function, so to speak, at the beginning to use the styles here. But other than that, it's very much similar to how you would use Tailwind on the web, and it's very simple to install. It's the Tailwind RN library. So there's currently 2 main libraries that are being developed. This is the more popularly adopted one. So you can just have a look in GitHub. It's very straightforward to install. And I think it's an added benefit that you can have very similar styling on your web and what you have on your React Native platform. And I think that's a massive win as opposed to having to adjust and adapt the styling specifically for mobile. So yeah, that's that with the demo. Let's quickly go back. So just finishing up on some final thoughts. I think that Tailwind has really spurred up this question about not repeating yourself within styles. And I think that's a very valid point that you don't see in a lot of styling. A lot of the styles that we write in our day-to-day happens to be very repetitive. It's not very in line with the functional paradigms that the web is now built on with React and other frameworks. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from Tailwind, and hopefully as it becomes more widely adopted, some of the criticisms that people have about it, whether it being too cluttered or various other criticisms that might arise from it, I think a lot of those hopefully gets addressed by the creators of Tailwind. Ultimately, I think it's a great way to quickly get things up and running, and it's a different approach, which I personally quite like. Yeah, with that, I think let's conclude. And if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to open the floor. Thanks.
Thanks, Mo, for that talk about Tailwind and speedy styling. I'm not going to lie, when you opened with the mirage of separation of concerns, I was like, where is he going with this? But it made sense. It made sense. So I was wondering before, again, we jump into questions. Could you tell us a bit about how you kind of discovered Tailwind in the first place? And what kind of converted you? Yeah. Sure.
Converted is an interesting choice of words, but let's go for it. So I was working on a side project with a friend of mine over the summer. We were colleagues together. And one day we were like, wouldn't it be cool to create some sort of app? You know, those ideas that you come up with and they never reach the day of light, the light of day. So we started, and he was like, I've seen this really cool new way of styling things. It's called Tailwind. I was like, okay. He was like, do you mind if we use it? I was like, it should be fine, thinking that it was, going to be very simple to pick up. And, we started off and I was like, what is this? I absolutely despise this. So my reaction was more like the third reaction that you saw in those rants that I showed earlier on. And as time went on and on, I was like, actually, this is quite nice. I don't find myself needing to define every single class that I do, and the styling looks beautiful out of the box. And so that was my first introduction. And after a long period of time, I've been using it on a lot of side projects, which has really massively increased my speed of development. Nice, sped you up, yeah. And suddenly one day you were giving a talk at a meetup about it. So you never know where you'll end up, right? Yeah. Cool. So we've got a few questions about Tailwind coming in. One from Seema here. This, I guess, is about utility-based styling. Mm-hmm. For what kind of projects are utility-based styling not suitable? In my mind, it actually works very well for projects that you have very strict guidelines to stick to. So let's say you have a company-wide standard of styles that you need to adhere to with the margins and with the paddings, which I've seen in my previous job. I think it works really well for that. In other cases, it might be a matter of if you want to adopt a new technology. I think it works quite well in most cases that I've seen. I've yet to come across a case that it doesn't work well with, but specifically if you're trying to, if you already have a specific paradigm that you've based a very well-developed project on, I think that introducing it as additional class names might not necessarily be straightforward. Right, fair enough. Makes sense. Got one from Liam as well as a follow-up. Are there several NPM packages for Tailwind? And why did you choose Tailwind RN? Mm-hmm. Yes, so like I mentioned on React Native specifically, there's, I believe, two main ones, although there might be smaller ones. They're all kind of tailored by the community. They're not created by the main creators of Tailwind CSS. Tailwind RN happens to just be the most widely adopted one, and I think it's the one that's got the most similar API or class names to the native Tailwind, the Tailwind CSS implementation. So that's on React Native Tailwind. On the side of if you were working on it on a web project, it depends. You essentially have to install it as an npm package, and I think there's one or two libraries that you install as part of that, and also the types that get automatically installed. However, I think one point that's important to note here is that when you're installing Tailwind, you're not actually installing a library on your actual bundle that you're sending out. What happens is that it's got a compiler, and it takes in only the classes that you happen to use, and it puts that in the CSS of the bundle that you're getting out. So you're not including all of these utility styles, the thousands of utility styles that they've created inside your bundle, and really slowing it down. And that's one of the really, really good points and pros about Tailwind, is that it is very fast in terms of performance, because it literally just compiles it down to whatever you've used.
Right, makes sense. Another one as well we've got coming in. Are there any templates available to combine different Tailwind classes? Because these long strings can be a bit hard to follow at times. I kind of sympathize with that, especially looking at it for the first time.
Yes. So in terms of combining them, this is still, I want to say, a point that the community is settling on. So if you look at the blog post that I was talking about by Adam Wanthan, he takes an approach when he was talking about utility first styling, where he takes a bunch of the smaller utility first styles, and if you're using them on a very common layer, let's say, you happen to take that away and you create a class composed of those different classes. You've extended those different classes. Now the Tailwind docs suggest that you don't do that. So I think it's a point of contention where there's different flavors of how people like to approach this problem. And again, I think it's one of the issues that still needs to be iterated on and learned from within the community. On the question of templates as well, if you're looking for sort of a template of getting started on with projects using Tailwind, and you don't know how to combine these classes to make something like a button or something like that from scratch, there are both community projects and a proprietary Tailwind UI library that's being created by the creators of Tailwind CSS, where they've combined these together and created, let's say, buttons or avatar components or stuff like that you can pre-use and customize. And I think the beauty of this approach is that if you have certain specific needs, you can still use those UI libraries, because you can just go ahead and change the CSS in places where you need to specifically tailor it to your use. It's not like using something like Material UI, where you need to strictly adhere to the API of the components as they're built logically.
Cool. Fair enough. Yeah, I had one. I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to ask John yourself, but I had one that I was kind of itching to ask, especially as you came to the end of that talk.
Sure.
I'm not gonna lie, it's super easy to add a lot of different styles using Tailwind, and I was sold on that as you kept adding and building your notification button. But doesn't that kind of go against the paradigm of consistency, because it is so easy to be inconsistent by just typing a few more characters?
Sure. And I think it's a balancing game, right? So in things like that, I think you should firstly, you should define your configs very sensibly. So the number of values that your let's say the units that you have for your padding or for your left and your right, they should be defined very sensibly and in line with the standards that you want to design. I think that's one step. The other approach is that if there are genuinely bits of reusable components that you can make, let's say within React, you should abstract them still into components. It doesn't mean that everything in the page should be lied down. And I think by still following those same ideas of using reusable bits of code and not repeating yourself, you can very much fix this issue of inconsistencies. And on that, something like different background colors. How many different background colors can you potentially come up with using something like Tailwind, as opposed to, let's say, the 400 that you found on GitHub or something like that? It's a lot less margin for error, in my opinion. But again, you need to be careful. It's not a foolproof method where it still requires caution, so to speak.
Right. Yes, it seems like defining sensible configs would stop people kind of just adding styles as and when they wanted, basically, into the app, and then ending up with the same problem of whatever 700 different font sizes and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much for your talk about Tailwind, and John as well. Thank you so much for telling us about Expo. I think we can all say it's a great first start to the Expo series. I love the kind of duality we had between Expo and talking about EAS and, you know, all the deployment stuff, and then going straight into UI and design. So yeah, next month we'll be having Charlie Cruzan from Expo talking about notifications. So you want to stay tuned for that. And we'll have a mystery second speaker as well from Theatre UK that we'll tell you about, possibly talking about testing. So yeah, thank you guys both for speaking at React Native London's October edition, and see you guys next month.